Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Susan Kelsey. Susan is the author of Billy Caldwell, 1780 to 1841, Chicago and the Great Lakes Trail. Now, following Chief Sauganash is a story about Captain Billy Caldwell and his life from 1780 to 1841. The story takes us from Old Fort Niagara through Amherstburg, Ontario, Detroit, Chicago, and to his final resting place, Council Bluffs, Iowa. Susan Kelsey lives in Lake Forest, Illinois, and was inspired by her mother and grandmother, who are both pilots, to enjoy history and adventure. Susan, it's such a pleasure to have you on the Success Insight podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Now, I have to say, as I was kind of preparing for the podcast, I was on your website, the book page. I know you have a presence on LinkedIn, but there's two things that really kind of jumped out at me. The first being Chief Sauganash, Billy Caldwell, because I'm a very good friend of mine who lived in the Sauganash neighborhood of Chicago, and I know the street Caldwell.
Yeah.
So as I learned more about your book, I'm like, oh, wow, that's pretty cool. So that was point one. Point two, and I do want to talk a little bit about this. Your mom and grandmother were both pilots?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So if you could, let's paint the landscape of your background and how you got into this world of being an accomplished author and it's a special interest in Native American history. And if you would, perhaps just a little bit share about your mom and grandmother's background as a pilot. I think that's pretty cool.
Well, let me start with them because my grandmother was a pilot in the 20s and she used to date a test pilot for Henry Ford. His name was Harry Brooks. And Harry Brooks used to fly the Flivver until it crashed down in Florida. And that was the end of Ford Motor Company. They made engines for these small airplanes, but that was the end of that testing when Harry died. So my grandmother used to be a barnstormer and she'd fly around the farm fields around Detroit. And that's where I grew up. And my mom always had a love for flying. And so when my grandmother passed away, she left some money for my mom and my mom went and became a pilot. And so I've been taking pilot lessons too.
Oh my. So, it's funny as you were starting to share that story, the word barnstormer raised itself up through my vault of long hidden pieces of information. So barnstorming, your mom was a pilot. And now, are you taking lessons now? Have you actually gone out and flown the plane?
Yeah, I've got about 45 hours in a Cessna 182, and I have to solo yet, but it's a lot of fun, and I really enjoy it.
That is pretty darn cool, I have to say. Give us a little bit about your background. I mean, this book, Billy Caldwell, Chicago and the Great Lakes Trail. I have heard of the Great Lakes Trail. I have to admit, it's probably a lot of people. They may have heard of it, perhaps in history. Maybe it was a line or a paragraph in a history book somewhere. How did your interest in this topic come to really take over a significant part of your life in doing the research and in writing the book?
Yeah, it really started when I lived in the neighborhood of Sauganash on the north side of Chicago. It was as simple as walking around the neighborhood, and I came across an intersection with a plaque in the ground, and it said the edge of Fort Dearborn. And this is where the treaty was negotiated under an old elm tree. And for the name of the neighborhood, Sauganash was named after this Native American, Billy Caldwell. And it was 1993 before the internet. So I got to wondering who this guy was and went down to the Chicago Historical Society and went to the Newberry Library and did some research and learned a little bit about why our neighborhood was called Sauganash. And it really started as a hobby. I would go and collect information once in a while. And then the internet came later in the 90s and I'd start, just searching through the internet and over the years. But I never really felt like I really understood who he was. And I didn't have more information than what I could find in the general public. So in 2014, I said to my mom, the adventurer, do you think we could drive out to Canada where he was born and maybe we could find some more information? And I think I turned around and her bags were packed and we left and we drove all the way out to Niagara Falls. Fort Niagara is north of Niagara Falls, a couple miles, and that's where we started our journey.
I mean, this sounds like the proverbial Route 66 journey. You start in downtown Chicago, you end up, somewhere in near LA, Santa Monica, or something like that. When you started walking the neighborhood, you came across this plaque. Where was it? Do you recall?
It's at the intersection of Kilbourne and Caldwell and I think Rogers. It's there now. It lies flat on the ground, an old bronze plaque. And there are very few Native American historical sites or markers. And this is one of them. And it's right near the edge of the Chicago River. So the neighborhood of Sauganash and also Edgebrook, which is just west of it, is part of the old reserve that was awarded to Billy Caldwell during the treaty. And so he was awarded 1,600 acres for his part in the treaty. And he never really lived on the land. He ended up selling all of it and moving west. And so over the years, I went to the library and they have a lot of old papers there and you have to wear the white gloves and to read everything. But it was funny, just last summer, I went back and just to see if there was any more new information. It's all the same information.
And who are the individuals like yourself that would go back and look at this information in the library, the Historical Society? What special interest would you categorize this as?
Well, I think for me, it started as a hobby, turned into kind of a curiosity, and then clearly into an obsession as the years went on. I think historians, people that kind of are looking for the truth on things. I think the more I learned about Billy Caldwell, the more I realized that we kind of had the same path. Our family came from Canada and moved through Detroit and came to Chicago about 150 years apart. But it was just kind of interesting. And I really enjoyed learning about him. And I enjoyed learning about his friends and kind of some of the decisions. And I can't even imagine how difficult it must have been during that period for him to accomplish the things he accomplished.
I want to get into some of these accomplishments and who this individual was. Unfortunately, our history books are written by, for the sake of a better word, the victors. They write the history. And I'm wondering, who is this man who is in a position to negotiate with the government at the time, the existence, I wouldn't even say livelihood, maybe it is the livelihood, the lives, the survival of a lot of Native American peoples, because this area that he was working to negotiate was large. And so I would imagine you had a lot of tribes there. Who was this person to be able to pull this off, so to speak?
That's what's kind of fascinating about him, and he's unusual. And other people that have researched him kind of say that he had supernatural powers. And I think, some of these romanticized notions are interesting, but clearly he had some leadership skills to be able to pull this off. His background is he's half Mohawk Indian, which is from upstate New York. And that was on his mother's side. On his father's side, his father had come over from Ireland and became a captain in the British Army. So he grew up at that time, was on the Canadian side. And so if you can kind of put yourself back into 1780, we're just a couple years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We don't have the advantage of a couple hundred years of history to look back. This is a new country with just a couple years behind them after the war. And so it must have been very fluid in terms of relationships and geography and politics. And to try to get a sense in 1780 about what it would be like, I think would be very difficult. So here's a young man who's growing up in this environment, just to put it into context. And he's also half Native American and half Irish. And as he starts to come across, at that time, the commerce is fur trading. There is a great demand in Europe for felt and for furs. And the United States of America back then had a tremendous beaver population and pelts. And so this opportunity for the new frontier for people to work with the Native Americans who understood the waters, understood the Great Lakes, understood the trails, and how to hunt. They worked up these relationships, and it led into the personal side, into marriages. And so that's how Billy Caldwell came up. He was Mohawk. In the end, he negotiated on behalf of the Potawatomi, the Ojibwa, and Ottawa. I just like to say he was in a unique place at a unique time. Just kind of the right time at the right place. And I'm not sure anyone else could have pulled it off. Because he had a foot in a couple of different worlds, the French world, the Native American world, the English world, the American world. He spoke a lot of languages. He understood politics. He had the history of coming from the East and moving west and saw kind of what was happening, kind of sweeping across the country. And so I think he had the opportunity when he was in Chicago, and obviously had some great negotiating skills because he could pull these diverse nations together and actually negotiate and trade 5 million acres to allow you and I to live here today.
As you write about him or wrote about him in the book and continue your research, your exploration about this man, what do you think the perception of the other side of the table was of him?
I think in the beginning, as a Métis, which is half Native, half usually Anglo or European, I think it was opportunistic. And I think they were on equal ground. And I think as they moved toward Chicago and as the population grew in Chicago, it started to shift. And he became in the minority and the whites were the majority. I don't think he could have pulled off what he did if it was 30 years later. I think the fact that he did it in 1833, he could not have done it in 1863.
And what did the Native American tribes get out of this transaction? Or perhaps maybe it was a series of transactions that ended up becoming this treaty. And you can please share that with us. But what did they get out of this? Because and I want to preface this by, again, our history books, we hear about, the Trail of Tears and all these other horrific events of how the government took advantage of the Native Americans. And again, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I think I would like to understand, what did they get out of this and how would they look back and look at this?
Sure. So if we go up to 30,000 feet and let's look what was happening in the United States, there were well over 600 treaties created between the United States of America government and Native American tribes. Every single treaty was broken, all 600 treaties. So they would create a treaty, and the treaty was broken. There's only one treaty, and it's the Treaty of 1795 in Canandaigua, which is upstate New York, that has elements that are still held up in court today. But almost every other treaty was broken, just to give you perspective. In this particular treaty, it was the mouth of the Chicago River had already been in an earlier treaty. It was the rest of the land from the southern part of Wisconsin, around the northeast side of Illinois, and over to Michigan. And so that was the final treaty. They ceded about 5 million acres. And in exchange for that, there were a couple of people that were Native American that received, for the first time in history, individual concessions. So Billy Caldwell was one of them. He received 1,600 acres. There was no other treaty before that would give an individual something in a treaty. His friend, Alexander Robinson, got some acreage, and that's up by Lawrence and River Road. I think it's in the Chicago city limits. And his reserve was there along the Des Moines River, and his body is actually buried there. His other friend, Chief Sauganash, was given some land about 70 miles west of Chicago, and it's near DeKalb, on the other side of DeKalb, and it's called Sauganash Grove. So there were a couple of individuals that received some land. And interesting, if you do actually read the treaty, there are a lot of other people that received. John Kinsey received things, individual white people that received things. So Chicago politics at its best.
Of course.
That was one of the questions I had about Billy Caldwell is his two buddies, Alexander and Sauganash, stayed here. And Billy went west. And I always kind of wondered why. You read the surface, read the headlines or maybe what people knew, but I really didn't have any answers about why would he leave. He had a good life here. He had rank and he had prestige and his friends were here and he had 1,600 acres right with the North Branch of the Chicago River running right through it. Why would he leave? And so that was one of the questions that drew me throughout the history and research.
And what did you find there?
A theory. So my theory is, I think he was a proud man, and I think this is just Susan's theory. I think he wanted to live a life of independence. And I think he couldn't do that in Chicago. He saw how it was changing. The politics and the land grabbing was going on. The I&M Canal was being opened up. There was a lot of Illinois selling land. And so homesteading was going on and land barons. So you can look at the old maps and see the names on them of a lot of the Chicago capitalist families that bought the land up. So I think he wanted to be independent. And so he moved west. He tried to go to Missouri first. And for some quirky little reason, there was just a little sliver of property that was part of the Louisiana Purchase that never fully closed. But when he was down there, they finished up that. So he got kicked north up to Iowa. He didn't want to go there. If you literally drive from Missouri up to Iowa, you can see why. The geography changes, the agriculture changes. Up in Council Bluffs, you had the Sioux Indian that were north, and the Sioux were a strong tribe, and nobody really wanted to fight with the Sioux.
And so, but he ends up in Council Bluff. Did he end up there? I guess I should get one thing I would ask is, how old was Billy Caldwell when he passed away? I mean, what was his age?
Yeah, he was 1841. He was 61.
61. And so he ended up, how long had he been well, first of all, how long, so this treaty started, when did it start? I guess that's a better question. When did it start?
Yeah, around 1833. And the way the treaty was written, there was 2 years before they had to leave. So they left around 1835. And there was, it took another 18 months or so for them to leave. They left in August and arrived in St. Joseph down in Missouri about, I think, September. So maybe 30, 45 days later. And I assume they went by horse and wagon. And so then they were in Missouri about 18 months. And then he moved up to Council Bluffs. And he was only in Council Bluffs about 3 years before he died. He was very hard living.
I can only imagine what it was like. And do you have a sense from the research that you've done, the papers you've read, what would he say looking back at history and perhaps what was accomplished? How did his people persevere? What do you think he would say? What would be his lens looking back?
That's a great question. Nobody's ever really asked me that before. I would think, he was good friends with Tecumseh. And Tecumseh tried very hard to create this Pan-American group to bring all the tribes together and to work as one. And it was really not really the Native American way. They were very independent. They didn't feel like the land was owned by anybody, and a very different sense of the creator than a lot of Europeans. I think he would be like Tecumseh, and he would say, if I knew now what I could have known back then, I would have tried harder to have more of a coalition and see if we can have a better life than what we got. Because even the reservations that a lot of the Native Americans got as they moved out west were carved up. And they originally started off with several 100,000 acres, and now they live on 11,000 acres and sometimes the poorest land around. So I think that's what he would have thought. I think he did the best he could do at the time. But had he been able to see into the future, he might have thought, maybe I could work a little harder to develop coalitions so we could stick together and create a better deal for us, for our family and our future and our children.
Fair enough. What has been the reaction to the book, Susan?
It's really funny. It's fascinating. There are a lot of people in this country that are interested in Billy Caldwell, and I had no idea. And I would go to Canada and I would post some things on Facebook. And I think that's the most fun part, is getting the phone calls. I put out something on Facebook and I got a phone call from somebody. He said, "Is this Susan?" "Yes, it is. My name is Chris. I'm a descendant of Laframbeau." And that was one of Caldwell's buddies, is Joseph Laframbeau. And so it's really people across the country that kind of have an interest in this man and who he was at that time.
And how are you continuing to keep the story alive, evolve the story? I mean, the book is obviously very new. How are you keeping this research and this work alive?
There's always more. So one of the things that interested me is when he died in 1841, he died in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And there were about a couple thousand Native Americans that lived there. And Council Bluffs is on the east side of the Missouri River. So that was also kind of interesting because most of the natives were pushed on the west side of the Missouri River, but he stayed on the east side. But soon after he died, about 5 years later, 1846, his entire tribe decided to move over to the west side of the Missouri River to one of two reservations that were created, one in Kansas, one in Oklahoma. And I think there's a lot more to the story. I was contacted by somebody who said he was a descendant of Caldwell. And so it's been kind of the next chapter, the next book, to try to figure out, well, what happened to his tribe when they left and how would this descendant fit in with that? And we're still trying to figure it out, but it's not a success story. It's a sad story. And so I guess one good thing that's come out of it is in Illinois, there's a brand new Native American Chamber of Commerce of Illinois. And so I've been working with them and trying to help them launch some of their new entrepreneurial businesses. And one of the businesses that's trying to come to Illinois is a new casino in Shabona Grove, where this partner was. And I thought, boy, this is just full circle.
I'm telling you. You just said something. It's kind of an aha moment as you were describing, his journey is when he traveled west out of Chicago, he actually took his tribe with him.
Yeah. He took almost everybody with him, except the two guys I was talking about, Alexander Robinson, who stayed here up by River Road in Lawrence, and Shabona, lived in Shabona's Grove. And Shabona would travel back and forth to see Billy in Iowa. And one time when he went there, the white settlers in Shabona Grove stole Shabona's property. So he came back and there was no property, but he had been such a friend to the white man that they gave him a place to live a little bit further south. And he's buried down in Morris, Illinois, right by Starved Rock, near Starved Rock.
If we could go back just a little bit, this story begins from Fort Niagara. As you were taking Mom, doing this research, I remember Fort Niagara when my parents would take my sister and I to Niagara Falls. And we used to, whether it was there or even up to Fort Mackinac on Mackinac Island, we've been there. You kind of walk around the fort, get the books, read about stories. What are some of the highlights for you and your mom as you were kind of essentially going down this trail that Billy Caldwell did, Fort Niagara, Amherstburg, Detroit. And I grew up in Detroit. So we had, what was it? Fort Detroit. I can't remember. Is that what it was called?
Yeah.
Or
it was Fort Detroit. There was a second fort, and I don't remember that name.
Was it Fort Wayne?
Yes.
Okay. I remember that. See, all that stuff is in the vault there, Susan. And obviously, I live in Chicago now. So what were some of the highlights and the, that you felt as you were kind of working your way down this trail back to Chicago?
When we left Chicago, I had no idea what we would find. I just thought there's nothing like trying to go back and walk in the same footsteps. So on the way there, we stopped in Holly, Michigan, where my mom's sister lives. I grew up in Detroit also, down at 7 Mile Road in Rosedale Park. And so we stopped.
By the way, you and I were almost like neighbors. I was 8 Mile in Coolidge.
Yeah, exactly. And so we stopped to see her sister, and we just happened to say, do you still have that family Bible? We're heading up to Canada to see where this guy, Billy Caldwell, lived. And she pulled out this 8-inch leather-bound Bible, and it showed that we had family that grew up in Brantford, Ontario, right where we were going. So these kind of interesting links, like I said, 150 years apart. But so we drove through there and we went up to Niagara, and I was kind of nervous because I didn't know what we would find. And in Old Fort Niagara, there was nothing. We got a little information about that year he was born, 1780. They said it was one of the coldest years on record, about 8 feet of snow. They found bodies and horses when the snow melted in the summer. I don't think the snow melted until May. But then when we drove down through Thamesville, we were on the phone with our cousin, and he said, "Where are you guys at?" And we're in Thamesville. Well, you know what the family secret is, right? No. He said, Tecumseh died on our family's farm in Thamesville. So it was just these weird coincidences as we were going through. But we got to Amherstburg, which is right across from Windsor on the Canadian side, and got there kind of late. Everything was closed. So the next morning we went back and went over to the chamber's office, and that was closed. So I went across the street to this cafe and kind of a local hangout. And we were sitting there having coffee, and we're like, well, where do we go? And so the waitress what are you two girls doing here? And so we're looking for some information on a Native American, and we'll go to the Genealogical Society. So sure enough, down the street, up on the second floor was this Genealogical Society. And I went upstairs, and the two ladies in there, and I said, they said, "Can we help you?" I said, "Well, I'm interested in a man that used to live here. He was born between 1780 and 1841, but he probably only lived here from 1785 until about 1804 or so. And I thought, what are the odds? She goes, just a minute. And she goes in the back and pulls out a big folder with all this information in there. Letters from Billy Caldwell, family trees, photo of his brother, pulled everything out. And I think I almost fell down right there.
Wow. That's like striking gold.
It really was. And what was so fascinating about it is, it was on the Canadian side, and they've preserved all the Native American history. Billy was part of the Indian department for the British Army. So they have his letters. They have all the information. They didn't destroy it like the U.S. did. If she said, would you like a copy of all this? And I said, yes. So I walked over and she's copying everything. And I look up over her shoulder, and across the street is a sign that says Rising Sun. And that was Billy Caldwell's mother's name. So these kind of like signs, I guess you would say, as you went all the way across. And then came through Detroit. Detroit's about 100 years older than Chicago, so they pretty much wiped out any kind of Native American history. Came to Chicago, like I said, I've researched pretty much everything that was here. So drove to Iowa. I did not do all this in one trip. I did it over the course of several years.
Gotcha.
And on that trip, I took my husband and we plugged. I knew he was buried in St. Joseph Cemetery. So we plugged it in GPS and we get over to Council Bluffs, Iowa. I'm with my husband and it's about 6:00 in the summer night. And it takes us to the outskirts of town and takes us to this person's house. And, you just never know. I thought maybe it was a pioneer cemetery, behind somebody's house. You just never know. So we're sitting in the car outside. I see the man come out of the house to his car. And I said to my husband, do you think I'll look crazy if I go over and ask him about Billy Caldwell? He said, we've come all this way. Go ask him.
Go do it. It's amazing. He told you to go do it. I'm going to stay in the car.
Yeah, so my husband, I'll stay in the car. You go ask him. So I went over and I said, I'm looking for a Native American by the name of Billy Caldwell. And the GPS brought me here. And he said, well, I'm the caretaker for St. Joseph Cemetery, and the office is in my home. But let me take you to where it is. And he literally drove us over to the cemetery, pointed us to the back corner and said, all the old stones are back there. So he left. Well, it's about 7:00 and then, starting to get a little dusk. And my husband and I read every stone there, couldn't find them anywhere. And so I kind of was disappointed, but I was really more afraid to get locked in the cemetery at night. So we left and we stayed at the hotel, drove home the next day. But I wrote a letter to the mayor of Council Bluffs. And I said, Billy Caldwell was an influential figure here in Chicago. And I was in your town and there's nothing really to recognize him. And would you be open to me doing a historical marker for him? And he put me in touch with a woman, 85-year-old Irish Catholic woman, which Billy was Catholic and Irish. And she had been a bigger fan of him longer than me.
Oh, wow.
We got in touch and we decided to do a Kickstarter campaign and we raised $4,000. And there's a monument in the St. Joseph Cemetery for Billy Caldwell.
That is fantastic. So, the journey that you took, perhaps somewhat like Billy Caldwell, is one of timing, being in the right place at the right time. You never know who you're going to meet, who is going to be there to provide assistance. And that's good. So looking back, what lessons have you learned?
Oh, you have such great questions. One is I tell my kids all the time, you can't find everything on Google. You got to go out and look for it. You have to make the effort. You have to kind of walk in the steps sometimes and feel what it was like to be in those places. Two, what lessons? I am so impressed, and it really impacted me, how he stayed with his friends through this whole journey. They followed him from New York to Detroit, and then they all came over to Chicago, and most of them went with him over to Iowa. And after he died, I found their gravestones in Kansas, in Silver Lake, Kansas. And it must have been something to have that kind of a friendship, that deep of a friendship. And I guess lastly, just as you think you start to know everything, there's so much more to figure out.
You never know when you keep turning corners what you're going to find. So that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Susan, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast and to learn about, Billy Caldwell or Chief Sauganash. If our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, and perhaps even the work that is being done today to keep the story of Billy Caldwell, the Native American tribes, the local tribes, perhaps here in Chicago and elsewhere alive? Where are the best places for them to go?
Well, the easiest is my website, SusanKelsey.com, SusanKelsey.com. I know that there's more information out there. I know something's in somebody's attic. There's an old Bible. There's photos. There's journals. I know there's more information about Billy Caldwell. And wouldn't that be great to add that to the story? I also have a Facebook page following Chief Sauganash I started several years ago, and feel free to add thoughts and comments and your own images. And I know we can learn from each other.
Fantastic. And I will say, speaking of images, I would love for our show notes on successinsightpodcast.com, if you could share some of those JPEGs with us so we can include pictures in our show notes, because that makes it extra special.
I have so many for you. Thank you.
Fantastic. And, anytime you want to kind of continue this conversation, maybe there's other conversations to tie all these pieces together, love to do that with you. Because I mean, if I was to go back and think about in high school, what was it going to be? I always loved history, and I was always fascinated when I would, again, buy those little booklets in the gift shops at Mackinac Island or Fort Detroit or Fort Wayne and Niagara. And it's just, it's kind of interesting to kind of hear about the real story as best that we can begin to know it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed being on the show. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Okay, folks, we have just been chatting with Susan Kelsey on the Success Insight podcast. And Susan is the author of the book Billy Caldwell, 1780 to 1841, Chicago and the Great Lakes Trail. What a wonderful story about Chief Sauganash, Billy Caldwell. And living here in Chicago as I do, the word Sauganash is familiar to me. Susan mentioned the street Kilbourne, one of my closest friends. She's like my mi hermana mayor, my older sister, lived on Kilbourne. And so, I mean, I know the neighborhood now. I have to go look and find that marker so I can see it for myself. But what an amazing story. At a time when our country was wide open, and really to kind of hear the story about this individual, this man, the land, his friendships, and really just the importance of Native American history in our consciousness. And, it's so nice to hear about it and the people who made it up. And we certainly appreciate Susan and her wonderful work to go and do this research. And really remember the shout out for her. If you know of anybody who knew of anybody, if you find some papers in your attic, hey, let's make it a point and share those with Susan. So, folks, if you would like to learn more about Susan, do go out to her website, SusanKelsey.com. We'll have a link to her Facebook page as well as to the book page on Amazon, so you can pick up a copy of Billy Caldwell, Chicago and the Great Lakes Trail. As for us on Success Insight Podcast, you'll be able to hear this episode, successinsightpodcast.com. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn. The main website will have the show notes and the pictures. You'll find us on YouTube and all of the podcast channels, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Buzzsprout, iHeartRadio, Spotify. I think I've got them all. And, we'd love your comments about today's episode or any other episode in general. So, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day, be safe, practice social distancing. Hey, if you got to stay home, read a good book. This one is it. So this is Howard Fox, and until next time, take care.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.